good morning and very warm welcome. It's a sunny winter day today. It looks very good now. I think I was hearing one of the panelists was talking about straight from Kashmir here, and the weather is similar in Kashmir. So it's an honor for Cambridge University Press to welcome all of you here today for this discussion, which is going to start in some time. University Press, which is part of university, is there in existence from early 16th century. And our pursuit is to work on the research or disseminate that as part of the university agenda, to further it, to take it to the scholars, to take it to the academia, and work in terms of creating more and more value, both for the ecosystem of research excellence, the education ecosystem or the higher education. And we work very closely with the authors. We work very closely with the academia to ensure keep doing that excellent work. Over the years we've been doing it, and it's an honor for us to host this session today. This is a very important topic, and we're looking forward for a very engaging session. Before I do that, I've been given a task to introduce author. I don't think she needs any introduction. All of you know her, but a brief introduction of Professor Zutshi. She's a professor of history at the College of Williams and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. She is the winner of Pulmonary Award for Faculty Excellence as well as several prestigious fellowships, and is currently chair of South Asia Council of Association for Asian Studies. Ma'am, she has been researching in this field of Kashmir over the last 20 years, and this is one of the books which she's done. Other sort of two books in the past based on the last 20 years of research, and I think it is important that I should mention the seminal works, and some of you have not really had a chance to go through that. Make sure that you actually read that book. These are really scholarly books. The first one is Kashmir's Contested Past, Narratives, Sacred Geographies and Historical Imagination, published in 2014. Language of Belongings, Islam, Regional Identity and Making of Kashmir, that's 2003, 2004. I think today's session, I'm expecting personally on behalf of press, should be very engaging. Nidhi, you're holding and hosting this session. Over to you, author. She will start with our sort of introduction to the panel, and then we can really take forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ratnesh, for that introduction, and thank you to Cambridge University Press for publishing this volume, for organizing this wonderful event. I want to, in particular, thank Qudsiya Ahmed, who's my editor at Cambridge. She's back there. Qudsiya and I have basically been in touch with each other from the first email that she sent me in August of 2015 to this day. I think at least twice a day we email each other, mostly me harassing her about various things and she, attempting to keep up. So thank you, Qudsiya. There are several others from CUP India who have been instrumental in getting this volume out in a timely fashion. If any of you are academics here, you know that edited volumes languish for years. This one came out in record time in a little over 2 years, and I think Cambridge bears a lot of responsibility for that. So Anvesha Rana, there's Aditya Majumdar, Sohini Ghosh, and also Gunjan Hajela for helping to bring this out in this timely fashion on this very important topic. So thanks to the press for publishing this. The other group of people that I really want to thank are the contributors to the volume. We are very fortunate to have 3 of them here. They're hidden away somewhere. I see one of them in the back. There's Suvir Kaul. Where are you, Suvir? Raise your hand. There you go. Suvir Kaul is here. Vanessa Chishti is here. Seema Kazi is here somewhere as well, buried somewhere, I think. So 3 of them are here. The reason that I'm thanking the contributors is not just because they contributed to this volume, but because of the work that they do on Kashmir, which is a very, very difficult region to work on. And they don't just work on it for, they don't just go for a couple of weeks and talk to a few people. They spend months and years working with new sources, digging up new materials, interviewing people, doing field work in a very, very difficult environment. And most importantly, they do interdisciplinary work. So even though they're rooted in particular methodologies, they draw on various different disciplines to bring that, bring forward their scholarship. And in fact, one of the primary motivations behind this volume from the very beginning, with both Kutsia and I were on the same page on this, was to bring these scholarly perspectives to you, not just academics, but lay people, policy makers, and so on, so that we can include scholarship in our conversation on Kashmir. As you all are well aware, conversations on Kashmir are often divisive and polemical. And what strikes me every time I think about the scholarship that's done by these people who are included in this volume, and many more, by the way, who are not included for one reason or another, is their integrity and honesty, and the diligence with which they do this work. A young scholar recently told me that with Kashmir, even before you have a chance to make sense of your research, you're slotted into categories. And to be able to transcend those categories and do the kind of work that these folk have done for this book, which I'm touching, but it's not here, it's here, is quite fantastic. And I really am very grateful to them for agreeing to be part of this volume. I also, of course, want to thank all of you for coming. There are some really old friends and colleagues and my family. I'm deeply touched to all of you for braving the Delhi traffic and the pollution, and some of you for flying in from outside or taking trains from other parts of India to be a part of this. Without your support and encouragement, I don't think I could have sustained my work on Kashmir, which I've been doing for over 20 years now, because again, as I said, it's very, very difficult to work on this region. So a deep, warm thanks to all of you for coming, and hopefully you'll enjoy this ensuing discussion. I have been now tasked with introducing this very illustrious panel, which really needs no introduction. But I will try to say a few words about each one of the panelists and the moderator, and then I'm going to turn it over to them, because frankly, all that I have to say about Kashmir is in this book and all the other books I've written, which I encourage you to get, if you haven't already gotten them. And so you're here to you're here to really hear from these folk and not me. I will rejoin you at the end after they've spoken, and I can answer any questions you might have. So let's start with Nidhi Razdan, with whom, of course, all of you share your living rooms every evening, or so there's no need to introduce her, but she's here anyway. So thank you to Nidhi. Nidhi is the host of Left, Right, and Center. She's also the editor of an eponymous volume called Left, Right, and Center: The Idea of India, which is published by Penguin. It's a wonderful collection of essays. You pick it up if you haven't seen it. In her introduction, she writes very touchingly about growing up in Kashmir and then going back to Kashmir after in the wake of the insurgency, and how things have changed and so on. So we're very happy to have Nidhi here with us. The next person that I'm going to introduce is Siddiq Wahid. Siddiq is an activist, a scholar, and an academic. His primary area of interest is Tibet and Central Asia and Ladakh. Siddiq was supposed to contribute a chapter on the interconnections between Ladakh and Central Asia, and pulled out at the very last minute, leaving us all in a lurch. But nonetheless, we are really happy to have Siddiq here to be part of the post-publication conversation, if he couldn't have been part of the actual publication. Thank you to Siddiq for coming all the way from Kashmir. Siddharth Varadarajan, again, needs no introduction. He's been editor of The Hindu. He's founding editor of The Wire. He is also an award-winning journalist. He's reported from a lot of conflict zones, I noticed, sort of Afghanistan, Iraq, and Kashmir. Of course, his work on Iran won him several awards. He's also the editor of a volume on the Gujarat riots. Again, something that I would recommend picking up and looking at it, because it's a wonderful collection of essays. So thank you, Siddharth, for being here. Salim Beg is the convener of the Jammu and Kashmir chapter of INTAC, the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. He was also Director General of Tourism in Jammu and Kashmir government before that. One of the things that I hope that you get out of this volume is that Kashmir is much more than the conflict, right? And Salim Beg has been instrumental in preserving the very rich art and architectural heritage of Kashmir, which is truly sort of an embodiment of the fact that Kashmir is a crossroads and a meeting grounds of several different cultural, artistic, and other heritages. So we're really grateful for Salim Beg to be here as well, who's also flown in from Jammu, I believe, right? Sitting right next to me is Navnita Chadha Behera. She is Professor of Political Science at Delhi University and the author of some really fantastic books. In fact, one of my favorite books on Kashmir is written by Navnita when she was a fellow at the Brookings Institution. It's called Demystifying Kashmir. If you haven't read it, please do, because it's again, I'm giving you a reading list. This is what I'm a professor. This is what I do. I just give reading lists. But the reason that I like Navnita's book is because it puts Kashmir in a global context, right? Because we tend to kind of think of Kashmir only in terms of India and Pakistan and so on. And in fact, what she does really well is give us a sense of the events in Kashmir from 1947 onwards in a much more, much broader context. She's also written many other books, state identities and in Jammu, Kashmir, Ladakh, and also people-to-people contact in South Asia, which is co-written with several other authors, and has chapters on Kashmir and Sri Lanka and so on. Navnita was also supposed to contribute a chapter to this volume, but she is not. I'm not holding her responsible like Siddiq, because she basically said she was too busy and so she couldn't do it. And so I'm very happy that she can also be part of this post-publication conversation, because we really wanted her to sort of have something to say. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Nidhi, who's going to moderate this discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, and congratulations, Chitralekha, for this really fine volume of essays that have come out. And I think it's very important that this book has come out at this time. I unfortunately represent a tribe that is contributing to great ignorance about Kashmir currently across TV channels night after night, with some exceptions. And I think it's great to have a book which is looking at various aspects of the state. It's not just looking at the politics. It's looking at very fine issues like what nationalism means to Kashmiris, how it's different from how you envision nationalism at the national level, to poetry. Suvir Kaul has written about that, to the Kashmiri shawl, to Kashmiri heritage. So it's all these various facets, I think, that make this book essential reading for today's generation in particular, who are growing up on this diet of Republic TV and Times Now. And I don't think understanding what Kashmir is really all about, what Jammu and Kashmir is all about. So I think this is a book that is valuable for that reason. And I will, for a change, speak the least today and hand it over straight away to our first speaker, Siddiq Wahid. All the speakers have 10 to 15 minutes to make their opening remarks before we open it up to questions and answers.
Thank you, Nidhi, as well as Chitralekha. I'd like to also begin by congratulating Chitralekha and all the authors for the book. It's a difficult book. And I think that another thing to be congratulated is Chitralekha's bravery in taking it on and then saying it that, we'll produce it in effect in 18 months. So I do really want to congratulate. There are full disclosures important, so there are three. One has already been taken care of, delinquency on my part. And I must say that she's very gracious in her introduction by sort of anonymously saying that there was this guy who was going to write on Ladakh from Kashmir, but he was traumatized, basically. I mean, that's not the word you use, but traumatized by 2016, which I was. And it was very difficult to write, quite apart from the logistical thing of things kept getting, the internet and the Wi-Fi kept getting off and on all the time. Having said that, I must also admit to another disclosure, which is that of laziness. In the sense that I have always been very conscious of the complexity of the Kashmir conundrum. And dispute, conflict, call it whatever you want to. And I've been sort of thing because, and so much so, that because I enter Kashmir not as an academic or a scholar, but as an activist, sort of Central Asia and Tibet being my other field, it is also because each time I write, I feel what my father used to call me having the sort of magnum opus complex. And that is that even if it's 1,000 words, you want to do every aspect of Kashmir in that particular article. And it was that held me back also in terms of this. So I must. And also, finally, I must say that I concentrated on certain chapters, and the reason for that in reading this book, again, for both for sort of reasons of my own interest, as well as the fact that I wanted to focus on those chapters in order to understand it, and why I focused it, I think focused on it will become clearer. You know, because my concern was more with the state of Jammu and Kashmir in its entirety. And I will address that in my sort of next few minutes, I think. I think a major problem in discussing Kashmir is the ethno-linguistic territory that is the valley as shorthand for the J&K state as a whole. You know, and I think that is a huge problem because I think it goes to the definition of the problem as it is. J&K state formed in the mid-19th century, you know, and the importance of that. I think this sort of thing speaks to the definition of the conundrum in the mid-20th to the mid-21st century. Because what was it? I mean, you know, basically it was a state that was formed in the 19th century, mid-19th century, and almost exactly 100 years, 101 years later, it had to be addressed. I don't think it was addressed, you know, as a state as a whole. I think Steve Cohen, I think in the late 90s, sort of expressed it best when he said that it's a layered problem, which is archaeologically layered, so that you need a political archaeologist to tell you what's going on, you know, and what is going on within it. So I think that, and basically the layers address historical idiosyncrasies, or the layers contain historical idiosyncrasies, you know, legal ambiguities and political inequity, all of them, and I might say in that order of priority. I think that's how it needs to be addressed as a state, you know. What are the layers? Let me just very quickly go through what I think are the layers. First, is it as a territorial problem of sovereignty? It's what emerged in 1947. And I don't think that has been addressed. Why a territorial problem? Because that's why wars are fought. And if we really think about it, 1947-48 war between India and Pakistan, the 1965 war, and the 1991 war, which is Kargil, I think that was called military action or whatever. You know, all of them were territorial in nature. So let's, you know, look at it and call that spade a spade, you know, is one thing. I think the next layer is what I sort of, with some hesitancy, call some sort of a meta-nationalism. And that was on the part of Pakistan, that, you know, it's Muslim, and therefore it automatically, the state is Muslim majority, and therefore should be a part of Pakistan. And the other, of course, is that of secularity, you know, on the part of the Indian state, which today now, I mean, is sort of being interrogated in big ways by the establishment and so forth as to what that means and whether it has any meaning or so. I think that was the second layer. I think the third layer that we have is the sub-nationalism. And the sub-nationalism was expressed, of course, by Kashmir, first of all, in 1931, which was against the Maharaja as such. It somehow sort of, I think as is pointed out in the book, it somehow sort of mutated into some sort of a Muslim Conference party, which then mutated into the National Conference Party, giving it a more secular color, and went on. But basically, it was a sub-nationalism that expressed itself in 1931. The next nationalism that was sub-nationalism that was expressed by Gilgit in 1947, when Gilgit went where it did in terms of declaring itself independent and saying we accede to Pakistan. The third one was Ladakh and Baltistan. Ladakh and Baltistan, because it was at that point, well, I say Ladakh and Baltistan, although it was Ladakh that was largely represented, which said that, hey, listen, if you force us into the Kashmiri sub-nationalism, then we are going to go into something called Tibetan nationalism, and we'll go with Lhasa. And it must have been before 50, because by 50, Lhasa was no longer independent. So at least that was the threat that came from the Leh district community of Ladakh. And things. And then finally, of course, you have other layers, which is the fourth set of layers, which is identity politics, which emerged in 1990, between, 91 and 93, with Kashmiri nationalism expressing itself in religious form. Then you had Ladakh, also in 1989-90, expressing itself again in very much in a religious mode. Jammu's Dogriyat, and then even devolved into being vocational, vocational identities such as Pahadis and Gujars and so Dokpas, for example, in Ladakh, who today identify themselves as Aryas, and many of them have renamed them Arya since the current regime, to say that we are actually the pure race, in Ladakh. I think that these are various layers. So what does it mean? I think I have another 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. So what does it mean? I think that I apply here the principle of a stitch in time not being taken. And when you have a stitch in time not being taken, then it devolves itself, and then you have fragmentation after fragmentation and fragmentation. And I think we've reached, to some extent, the limits of it. And so therefore, my sort of bias, if you will, or even prejudice, I'd go so far as saying, is that it needs to be addressed at the beginning, for whatever it's worth, as a controversy, as a dispute, as a conundrum between three states which were there in 1947 as a result of historical idiosyncrasies, as a result of legal ambiguities, and as a result of deep political inequity of some sort. Again, in that order. And it needs to be all of them addressed at the same time in some way with regard to the state of J&K erstwhile. I include Gilgit-Baltistan and, of course, AJK, for it. I think that is how we have to look at the book, and that's how I would encourage ourselves to read. Does the book achieve it? I think remarkably, in a lot of ways, yes. But I think that, again, that fluidity between, addressing it as an ethno-linguistic value of Kashmir issue, as opposed to the state as a whole, it achieves sometimes and it doesn't achieve the book. And it goes back and forth between the two. And I'm happy to sort of share some examples of it if you want, and if there's time. I think the difficulty of avoiding the pitfall between Kashmir and the J&K state as synonyms is something that I certainly have a difficulty writing about it, you know, and I think that the same problem is experienced by the book in certain spaces, and it's at a lot of the times, including, for example, in Andrew Whitehead's thing, where he actually, I mean, where he's discussing it, and then it ends up being actually about the valley, if not a biography of Sheikh Abdullah and his political career. You can't have that. You know, was Ladakh consulted at that time? No. When Naya Kashmir, for example, was put up? No, it wasn't. It wasn't because why? Apparently there's a signature on it, on the original, but that was, they said, hey, listen, you know, you forgot Ladakh, so they sent somebody as far as Kargil to fetch 2 people from Kargil, bots as they're called in Kashmiri, you know, to sign on the document. That's not participation of any sort. So I think that sort of does appear. I think I've also mentioned you know, Andrew's sort of thing already on it. There are some, I think, other things, of course, to speak positively, very positively about the book, and in the sense that I was, I mean, I was impressed by, let me tell you, many of the chapters that I read, including the introduction. I mean, I think that was versatility, you know. But I think that one that I found exemplary was Seema Kazi's chapter on gender issues and crimes against women. I thought it was remarkable because 3/4, or if not more, of that chapter was upon the J&K dispute, disentangling it and getting it out, and then mentioning the you know, gender issue in that context. And so I thought it was very illuminating in that sense, I think. And also, of course, slight bias, Gilgit and Baltistan chapter by Sokfeld, I found very good because, again, that added the element, and Ladakh, of course, would have completed the book and things. So, but you know, the one to blame is addressing you right now, so there's nothing I can say any more about it. But I think it was there also where the very good phrase, you know, part of the dispute, but not part of Kashmir. I think that's a great line, you know. I think that it's a great one. The only sort of thing being that will be applicable then to Kashmir itself, as it would be to Ladakh, as it would be to Gilgit and to Baltistan and to Jammu. You know, it would have been applicable to all of them. In other words, you know, what we are seeing in the creation of the state of Jammu and Kashmir is the convergence of its 5, well, broadly speaking, 5 units, you know, at some point of a cusp in history, which got together and somehow formed a state. Whether the Brits did it, whether it was Ranjit Singh of the Punjab, or whether it was Gulab Singh's opportunism, I think that is something that's up for grabs. But I think that's what we have to contend with, and I'm going to stop.
Right,
thank you.
Thank you very much, Siddiq. Actually, that's a great introduction, because I think you were able to put a lot of things into perspective, a macro perspective on what we're going to talk about. So, Siddharth, you're the next speaker, 10 to 15 minutes, which I am starting now.
Thank you very much.
Then I don't feel so bad.
Thank you to Kutsia of CUP for inviting me to this panel, and of course to Chitralekha Zutshi for bringing out a wonderful volume. It's a volume that's essential reading, not just because J&K ought to occupy top of mind space for Indians in general, but I think particularly at this time, but because it captures the complexity of the problem. It's not a flat unidimensional issue, as Professor Siddiq Wahid noted. Most discussions and debates on J&K get reduced to the political dispute in the valley and public perceptions in the valley, and of course there's a lot more to J&K, or to the erstwhile princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, than normally gets into public discussion and debate. And I think the great merit of this book is that it reminds us of the many layers of the problem, if you will, and the fact that any solution that we think of has to address each of these aspects in one way or the other, regional, gender, caste, issue of livelihood and political economy. Ecology doesn't, or environment doesn't really get too much of a look in, but I would flag that as also an essential part of the conversation. And I think that insofar as this moves us away from a purely security-driven discourse on J&K, this book is, I think, a wonderful and timely addition to existing literature on Kashmir. Having said that, this book comes to us at a very difficult time. In many ways, the wrong time. Because as a journalist, as an observer of national political affairs and J&K, it seems to me that the terrain has shifted somewhat and shifted in a rather unhelpful direction. And there are a number of complexities that have come onto the table that make it much more difficult to have a rational dialogue on not just the political issues of J&K, but the wider set of problems that this book identifies. And I just want to spend a few minutes focusing on what these complexities are and how they might affect academic and public discourse on J&K. And the first one is really, it's a political complexity. It's very clear now, 4 years into this government, that you have, for pretty much the first time since 1947, a ruling arrangement in Delhi that is looking to not simply manage a crisis as we have seen over many decades, or pretending the crisis doesn't exist, or as in the case of Atal Bihari Vajpayee or Manmohan Singh, thinking aloud about different possibilities, both as a dialogue within J&K and as a dialogue with Pakistan. So, if you look at the practice of governments of India up to 2014, they've either pretended that the problem doesn't exist and chalta hai, maybe we can get by without taking any initiative, or they've tried to work along the lines that there is a problem. There is a problem that of a trust deficit between New Delhi and the people of the valley in particular. There is a problem that India and Pakistan have to resolve. And this has been central to Indian statecraft's approach to J&K in the 2 decades preceding 2014. What's happened since then, and I think this is becoming more and more clear now, is that you have a party, a government, a parivar, or an arrangement in power that sincerely believes that the existing statecraft is fundamentally wrong. And that, going back to the conditions under which J&K acceded and the whole, Jansang approach to Kashmir in the late 40s, early 50s, they fundamentally believe that what the rest of the political class takes for granted, which is that J&K acceded under a certain set of conditions. Those conditions were the basic narrative, right, which most people who've held power in the state have, the Indian state have subscribed to, is that it's the attenuating or the weakening of those assurances over the years, combined with in some cases blatant dishonesty on the part of the government of India, rigging of elections, human rights violations. All of this has created a complexity that New Delhi needs to address. The current set of rulers don't accept any of that. They see the J&K problem as the product of appeasement, product of concessions, product of the center being too kind to J&K and to the valley, and they look at dialogue between New Delhi and Islamabad as not helping find a solution, but actually making things worse. And it's very clear now over the last, if you look at New Delhi's practice over the last 2-3 years, that we are dealing with a very different type of government and a very different type of approach. And they are not interested in looking at any of the political initiatives that Vajpayee or Manmohan Singh took, which generated a certain amount of traction. One can debate how sincere or effective those initiatives were, but they did come up in a certain context and they were pursued with a certain frame of reference. The Modi government does not share those frames of reference at all. And I think this has introduced a new complexity whose repercussions or ramifications we are beginning to see now. And I dare say in the months and years ahead, you will see this in even sharper relief. The second complexity is, which again messes up our ability to have rational debate, is something that Nidhi Razdan referred to in her opening remarks when she talked about television channels. Television channels, particularly the two that she mentioned, but there are more. They have, I don't know how empirically valid what I'm going to say is, but I think that they have altered the national debate or national discourse on J&K in a very, very atrocious way. When you have even so-called mainstream Jammu and Kashmir panelists on television channels, PDP people, NC people being shouted down as anti-national, as Pakistan agents, as Afzal gang, and you have these tickers that run basically labeling these guys as pro-terrorist. And actually, on the part of these anchors and these channels, systematic humiliation of any sane or even any Kashmiri voice that is not fully in tune with the BJP's thinking, or this pseudo-nationalist or hyper-nationalist line that anchors like to push. I think that this has poisoned the atmosphere, and now that this has been going on for several years, I think it has made the rest of India, it's made Indian civil society far less receptive to the kind of broad-minded initiatives that the government of India needs to take, if at all there is to be a democratic, just and fair solution to the problems of J&K. So I think that this poisoning of the Indian mind that our television channels have done is another layer of complexity that I think complicates discussions and debates. And when I say that it alters the terrain for a debate even on a book like this, these kinds of anchors would latch onto a book which talks about caste, and we'll use this as an argument to say, well, there's no problem then. Why are you so fixated only on J&K? And we've seen this in the past also, where different analysts have said, well, J&K is not just the valley. You have Jammu, you have Ladakh, you have Bakarwals, you have Kargilis, you have Shia, you have Sunni. So they will slice and dice the problem of J&K any which way you can, to say that, well, we don't need, we can easily avoid the centrality of the dispute. We don't need to focus or spend too much of time on that. And I think that today, the way that the national conversation has changed, thanks to television, is something which I think has made rational discussions and debates more difficult. The third complexity, I think, has to do with the changing means of communication. Even though the government of India frequently resorts, and Professor Wahid referred to this, internet shutdowns or SMS shutdowns and so on and so forth. And so there is an attempt to stifle the voice of people in J&K, particularly in the valley, at moments of crisis. And they use quite sophisticated technological means to shut down people's ability to communicate. But the fact is that people find ways to communicate, and no matter how much the state tries to stop people from finding new ways of association, these new ways and means do exist. People do use them. And it has made the suppression of, it has made the articulation of Kashmiri grievances more real, more vivid. In many ways, it's something that cannot be avoided. You cannot avoid confronting, photographs, memes, issues that come up. People, have, and it's, this is a complexity that, again, plays out in unexpected ways. For one, the Indian state is unable to, fully regiment the way people think, or to have a blackout on information. Those photographs of Farooq Dar tied to a jeep came out because mobile phones are ubiquitous. People had access to Twitter and Facebook before somebody decided to shut down access to the net. It's a different matter that the way in which finally, thanks to these channels, Farooq Dar's image played out was reprehensible. It was ghastly that you could have something such a blatant violation of the Indian Constitution, of any civilized norms, being turned into its opposite. But I think that And that in turn, I mean, the fact that people in J&K are able to have those conversations, are able to use internet, despite all official restrictions, is a new complexity. It's not a negative complexity the way that the first two are, but it's something that we need to take on board. The fourth complexity has to do with, I think, changing geopolitics. Often too much is made of this. I think that geopolitics, which loomed large in discussions or debates on J&K in the late 80s, early 90s, I think after 9/11, the terrain shifted in a very fundamental way. But I believe we are right now again at a moment when geopolitical shifts are going to be felt in the region. U.S. Trump, this may be a momentary Trump Pakistan may be a momentary highly visible dissonance, but there is a sense in which the rise of China, the decline of the US, particularly in this region, is going to alter the terms of engagement. And I think that this is, again, going to be a new factor whose presence we're going to feel. The final complexity, I think, also has to do with the changing nature of conversations within the valley. I was there last week, and I was struck by, I don't know what to describe her as, but let's say an ideologue or of the Azadi point of view or Hurriyat. She said many things at the seminar, but one thing that remained in my mind was she objected to the way in which the term Kashmiriyat was being used. And she said Kashmiriyat, and she may be right. I mean, Kashmiriyat is often used even by those who believe the Indian state can do no wrong in order to push Kashmiri points of view or Kashmiri debates in a certain direction. But there is also a positive sense in which Kashmiriyat is something which helps people in Kashmir politically. And so one of the points that this academic made was to say that this idea that there is a gulf between scriptural Islam and the Sufi and Rishi and saints tradition is again something which is being imposed artificially on the Kashmir debate. There is, in fact, she contended, no difference whatsoever between scriptural Islam, quote unquote. And again, what that means is, you have a wide variety of views, but I suspect there was a sense in which the specificity of religious practices, cultural practices in J&K were being downplayed by those who are in the Azadi camp. And I'm not sure that this dimension, this complexity is something which is going to be very helpful for future discussion and debate, particularly if it leads to a narrowing of points of view, narrowing of what's acceptable, what is not acceptable. So just to wrap up, because my time is up, I think that a book of this kind, which approaches J&K in terms of history, in a layered fashion, history, region, looks at caste, I think, like Professor Wahid, I think the bringing AJK and Gilgit-Baltistan into the mix. I would have liked perhaps a little more on the complexity of political movements there. I was struck, one of the few Indian journalists who managed to make a visit to Gilgit and Skardu in, I think it was 2001 or 2002, and I met several, I mean, they may be small and fledgling, but you have not just people who want in Gilgit-Baltistan to merge formally with Pakistan. You also have others who have different points of view. There's a nascent separatist trend. It would have been good to capture some of that complexity as well, but that's a minor quibble. I think all told, this is a very, very useful contribution, and I'm grateful that Professor Zutshi produced the book, and to everybody who gave chapters here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Siddharth. For actually, kind of laying out very concisely what the issues are in contemporary Indian politics, especially vis-a-vis this government. I want to say I also went to Gilgit. I think it was in was it 2004?
Right,
yeah, we went together. And what you're saying about these political trends is very true. In fact, it was interesting. I met I don't know if you met the guy, but I met this government official there who was writing under a different name for the nation and abusing the government of Pakistan every day. So it's very interesting, the complexities in Gilgit. Mr. Beg, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'd like to go slightly back in the history and look at this book and books by authors like Chitralekha and Roy. before this book was published. And this book makes a statement in the introduction that all the scholarly voices that have emerged in the past 2 decades, which have brought together a lot of current research. Well, honestly speaking, this book answers or substantially answers questions which have been in our minds. In our minds means the preceding generation and the generation which has followed us. And that question is, what does this word freedom mean to us? What are we calling freedom? And we know, even while it was very clear that there will be a India, there will be a Pakistan, and these countries will emerge, we were still calling for freedom, talking about freedom. In fact, this book refers it to the cabinet mission in 1946, which was working in India or working in the subcontinent, which led to partition. The NC told them that we, as Kashmiris, first want to be free. Then we will talk about India or partition or the larger political issue. So what was it we were talking about? This book, as I said, substantially answers this question in historic terms. It says, and it's perhaps in the introduction of Chitralekha, where she says that it's not only a geographic entity, it's also an idea. And that's how Kashmiris have thought of themselves, rightly or wrongly. And the book mentions that in Nilmat Puran, in Raja Tarangani, they say this is a sacred kingdom. It has been created through a divine intervention. Then following from that, the Muslim rule, they said this is a sacred space, and we Muslim Persian writers called it Bagh-e-Sulaiman, things like that. That's how they have treated this space in their mind, which in the modern idiom means that they thought of an identity, perhaps independent of other identities, or an exclusive identity. Was this identity also supported by other political forces in this country? We are not very sure about what the intentions were, but we know what has come to public's domain. We know we had a movement in Kashmir, which was led by Sheikh Abdullah National Conference. It was a very popular movement, and Sheikh Abdullah kept on saying, while Congress supports movements in princely states, Muslim League does not support it, they support princes. That's one claim. Sorry? In 1946, which is immediately after the Quit Kashmir movement, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the principal player in the whole game, comes to Srinagar, and he makes a very significant statement that's contained in this book, which says that the story will go on till it reaches, it's talking about the Quit Kashmir movement in Srinagar, which was like Quit India movement. Till it reached the logical end of establishment of, please note this was, freedom of Kashmir within the larger framework of free and independent India. Andrew Whitehead says that we didn't understand this nonce, but I would like to be sure about it that did we not understand it, but at that point in time, even after the instrument of accession was finalized, we had this Constituent Assembly. I'll come in a minute to Constituent Assembly. And that Constituent Assembly, which was an instrument of the Constitution, and in fact an instrument of the Constitution of India, under Article 37 Constituent Assembly was created. And this assembly, Constituent Assembly, as all such constitutional bodies, have a basic principles committee, which frames the basic principle. And that basic principles committee was chaired by Mirza Afzal Beg, who was at that point in time a revenue minister, perhaps the only law-knowing senior minister in Sheikh Saab's cabinet. In the preamble, not in this book, but from another reference, what he says is, the Kashmir will be the autonomous republic within the Indian Union. Now, when I related, this is 51, and when I related with 46, I find that this is the idea which the mind which Nehru had given or Nehru had, which was perhaps also the mind of our leadership. And in 51, when Kashmir Constituent Assembly thought of a autonomous republic within the Union of India, nobody objected to it. And this is 4 years after accession. So that is what was perhaps thought about in Kashmir in constitutional terms. But down the road somewhere we went wrong, and we don't know how we reached where we have reached now. Because I know suddenly last year we had this GST application to Kashmir, and our Kashmir bar went to Supreme Court here. And while making their submissions to the Supreme Court that state has financial powers to frame their own laws on financial matters, they talked about sovereignty of the state legislatures, and they were frowned upon. What sovereignty are you talking of? You can't use Supreme Court platform for this. Now the same Supreme Court, way back in 1957, in Premnath Kaul's case, in fact, is this, no, some other book citing it, says that Kashmir has acceded only in the areas of whatever, 3 or 4, communication perhaps being the 4, and the Constituent Assembly will take a view on residual matters. And Constituent Assembly did take a view on those matters. So the idea basically is that this notion of freedom in Kashmir is not something which was created out of atrocities of India. It was not also created because Sheikh Abdullah was not treated well in person. It is something which was in the mind of Kashmir. It has always been in the minds of Kashmir, which perhaps Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru tried to answer, or tried to answer for some time, because finally we know where things went wrong. So this urge has always been there. Now, was this urge of freedom from India, or was it the urge which was expressed in the Basic Principles Committee? There are questions. We don't know what finally came to surface. So that is one. The other thing is, how did Kashmir leadership pick up and support instrument of accession? There are two ways of looking at it, or there are two opinions about it. One is that yes, they were part of the, mentally or philosophically or ideologically, they were part of the philosophy of accession. Two is that accession had already taken place. They were left with no chance except supporting it. If Sheikh Abdullah would not have supported it, he would have ended up as another refugee in Pakistan. He would have been sent across. But I think Sheikh Abdullah had dreamed about a Kashmir, and dreaming of Kashmir perhaps included the dream which Congress leadership, in fact, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had about a place like Kashmir, which you know, he said this is perhaps something which is beyond desire, or this is mild intoxication. Your book mentions that. What he does is, even while Sheikh Abdullah was heading Muslim conference, which had a progressive agenda, even as Muslim conference, not that when it converted to national conference, it became very progressive, socialist, or a liberalist organization. Even as Muslim conference, it was a very progressive organization. The constitution was progressive, idiom was Islamic, because they were talking to Muslims who had for the first time heard certain voices. He goes on a trip with Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru as Muslim conference chief to northwestern frontier area. It's another Muslim area. And he meets Ghaffar Khan, who was known as Frontier Gandhi at that time. And he saw a space, a political space, a space of identity within the Union of India, or within India, exclusive of Pakistan. So that is something which was ingrained in his mind, and he could see that happening in frontier. He was always looking back at Kashmir through the eyes of Ghaffar Khan. In fact, when Ghaffar Khan came last to Kashmir as Sheikh Abdullah's guest, that's how he was treated, as Sheikh Abdullah was reminiscing about what he saw at that time in western frontier. So Sheikh Abdullah thought that yes, we have a space within the Constitution in India, and for that purpose he thought accession. In fact, at one point of time, when the instrument acceptance of the instrument of accession mentions about by reference to the will of people, United Nations resolutions mentioned by reference to the will of people, which was commonly known those days as referendum or later on plebiscite. Sheikh Abdullah in New York did say we might not even need to have hold referendum in Kashmir. He thought we don't need to because we will have enough space in India. Did that happen? We know that did not happen. And why that did not happen has been very elaborately mentioned or hinted by Siddharth Varadarajan, and I think we should take note of that. The other idiom which, the other purpose which this book has served, or the books written before them have served is that it is looking beyond politics at Kashmir. It's looking at the religious background, even the sectarian background, and the politics of shrines, which is dominantly mentioned in this book and the books preceding this. The first ever success in the last 300 or 400 years which Kashmiris have achieved is that when Pathar Masjid and Mullah Shah's mosque was vacated during Dogra's period. They have never had such a exciting time when they saw that they demanded that Shahi Masjid should be returned back to Muslims and there should be no temple there, because Maharaja Ranjit Singh had thought that we will convert Shahi Masjid into orphanage in the name of Lord Hanuman, and we will have a murti of Lord Hanuman. So in bare terms, Shahi Masjid would have a murti inside it. That's what was planned. And Jammu Masjid was a granary. Mullah Shah's mosque was again occupied, perhaps horses were kept there. And the first demand of the agitation was vacation of these cultural spaces for Kashmiris, and which was substantially met, in fact wholly met. So that's for the first time Kashmiris thought that if we struggle democratically, follow a leadership, they thought that they will be able to achieve what they want to achieve, and they substantially achieved that. So basically, we did not only lose Kashmir in terms of that idea of Kashmir, we also lost in Kashmir what we had dreamed for India. We succeeded in India substantially in establishing the institution of democracy for a very long period, and perhaps in a larger extent also secularism, socialism. But in Kashmir, we seem to have defeated all this. And once we do it, and when this happens, we still ask this question, why are they clamoring about Azad? I mean, that is something which needs to be addressed in all seriousness, and happy to say this book and the preceding books are trying to do that and have in a large measure succeeded in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you, Beg Sabanakri. I think it was very fascinating, and I also think that is the most interesting question. What does freedom actually mean? And you really explained that very, very well, going back into history. Navnita Behera is the last speaker before we open this up to the audience.
Thank you. I want to congratulate Chitralekha and all the contributors for what I really found to be a very enjoyable reading on the book. Kashmir has been, I must say, a very learning curve for a very early scholar. I've been working on Kashmir for almost about 25 years now. I grab every book that comes with much excitement to learn something new. And I think basically what I'm going to offer is there are two ways of reading this book. One is, and I'm using pure social science tools, being a good old academician. One is in terms of social scientist toolkit of trying to understand as complex a problem as Kashmir. And personally, I'm saying this as much as reading out of the book as my own research in Kashmir for more than 2.5 decades, as to why that toolkit is failing to understand how I think social scientists as a tribe have failed Kashmir. And where does this book come in there, and how do we need to retool ourselves to start understanding Kashmir? And again, where does this book fit in that discursive body of literature? And what is it that it offers in terms of by way of trying to find new ways of creating knowledge on Kashmir, and where I think it still has some homework to do, because Kashmir, I find, is a steep learning curve. You know, it never stops teaching you. I can read all my books in one visit to Kashmir, and I can put all my books aside and I start learning afresh. So it's a huge learning ground, for a social scientist. And where I found most interesting was that, and again, this is a trained political scientist, IR scholar, trying to honestly question our own, as I said, tools of the trade. I think we need to basically develop new research tools to learn to listen to what people have to say. I think social scientists are following our old methods of doing social science. And in Kashmir, to my understanding, they are completely turning into an abject failure. And in this book, the chapters particularly I personally enjoyed reading most was the chapter on cinema, the chapter on poetry, the chapter on urban spaces, the chapter on archaeology. All these, to my mind, offer very different vantage points of entering into the politics and the society of Kashmir. They offer you different intersections. They don't shy away from addressing the politics. So I would not say they're apolitical. They're very political, but they are using very different terrains that we tend to overlook. They do tend to interrogate what is sort of below the surface, the subterranean realities which exist, but I think we have not sufficiently engaged with them. We have not really gotten to understand them in all the complexities. And complexities, to my mind, is a word that is the second nature of Kashmir. Before me, Siddiq talked about it, and much of what Siddharth said, I agree with. This is the advantage of being the last speaker. All the illustrious speakers, whatever they've said before you, you don't have to repeat it. So I would just simply, very simply say that I agree with a lot that was said there. But I just want to not talk so much in terms of the political project of the Kashmir, because I think it's about time that politics begins to learn from those segments and those terrains in the society that we have deliberately rendered apolitical. And I think it's a loss to our understanding of Kashmir by not opening our minds sufficiently enough to listening to those kind of voices. The last visit that I had in Kashmir about 3 months ago, just by way of explaining, I spent about 4 hours just walking around the city of Srinagar and taking pictures of shut down shutters. And I learned a lot. From nationalism is haram, which tells me a lot. It's not just a off-cut, slogan that has been put over there. But what I've found most capturing of the spirit is the contesting narratives. So the stone pelters and the militants will come on the right on the shutters of the shut shops, Free Kashmir. And I guess overnight in another ink you can see next day you'll find Free Kashmir from stone pelters written at different ink. And next day overnight that stone pelters would be cut out with a different ink and would be written Free Kashmir from India or Go Back India. And Go Back India would next day turn into Good India. It's just fascinating, so you just have to walk down the streets of the state and be willing to learn to what people have to tell you. And I think social scientists particularly have a lot to learn there. And this book I really enjoyed, particularly the chapters that they talk about representation, and the first 2 chapters of history, Chitralekha's chapters, Midurai's chapters on archaeology. I think it's interesting to understand how these spaces have addressed the politics of Kashmir, have addressed the societal dynamics of Kashmir, and there's so many layers right out there which are waiting to be addressed, which are waiting to be understood. That's what I found something really fascinating, about the book. Where I find, that a lot more could have been dealt, a lot more could have been done with the opportunity that was there. For example, both the chapters on Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. I'm really glad that those chapters were there, because this is what I call a silenced part of Kashmir's history. Nobody talks about Azad Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. But I really wish those chapters also sort of engaged with the authors of other chapters of these books in terms of how to create a new knowledge of Kashmir, because they get into somewhat political narrative and they don't get out of that political narrative. So, Azad Kashmir in terms of what it is, what are its political choices, is to my mind very restrictive and already in the public domain. What I would have really liked to know about was, what about the communities? What about the linguistic groups out there? How about those linguistic groups are engaging with their regional aspirations, sub-regional aspirations? How are they negotiating with each other? Within Gilgit-Baltistan or across Azad Kashmir or across to the idea of Kashmir or across their position with the idea of Pakistan. That would have been really interesting to get to know. On the Indian side of the chapters, I really enjoyed, one chapter that was talking about the idea of the freedom. I think it's really important to historicize and historically contextualize the idea of the freedom, because it's got a very rich meaning to it. So I'm really glad that somebody's gone in there and sort of fleshed it out, so to say, that it doesn't. Azadi is much abused, much admired, much sort of passionately argued word when it comes to Kashmir. I can just explain one example. About 5 years ago, we were engaging with the Kashmiri youth and trying to understand from there that what goes into making of the mindset of a Kashmiri youth. And I remember when I was designing the questionnaire, we said, all possible options from a sovereign Jammu and Kashmir state to a merger of Jammu and Kashmir state, put all the options there and put Azadi there. And I knew instinctively as a political scientist that 80% of my respondents were going to go and pick in Azadi. So, and then 7 questions later, I told my, research students, teams, I said, whosoever has answered Azadi there, 7 questions later, ask them the same question. I said, your idea of Azadi, and write it verbatim. Do not try put words in their mouth. Whatever they say, you write it verbatim. And we used our good old social science tools to understand what did they mean by Azadi. And the diversity of ideas that we got from there was exactly, to my mind, the colors of Azadi, as we say. It had questions about political rights, civil rights, economic rights, sovereignty, yes indeed. But that wasn't the only thing. The richness of that debate was an eye-opener. And I think that's the richness that we miss out on when we collapse it all and either put it in a separatist color or a secessionist color or in an Islamist color. We lose the different strands of that debate, a very rich debate that comes across. So I really enjoyed, reading that chapter. Also a chapter that nobody's talked about, Mohita's chapter on the caste component in Jammu. It's a much neglected area, so I'm really glad that somebody picked it up and addressed it. I'm waiting to see a similar chapter on Kashmiri Muslims. I learned last time that I was traveling in the valley that caste isn't entirely an absent element, even in the valley. But it is not much talked about. Again, in the social science literature, there is complete silence on it. So I think that's an area that is sort of still waiting to be addressed here. But in terms of the politics of Kashmir, I really wish political scientists, and that includes me too, we learn to engage a little more in a more robust manner with the anthropologists, with the sociologists, with the historians, with the people on the ground, and come up with new voices that need to be kind of really heard. And the reason I'm saying this, and I'm going back to for just 2 minutes on what Siddiq started with, I think 2016 is not adequately understood. 2016 has really changed the tenor of the discourse. I personally don't think we have come to grapple with implications of all that. The pellet injuries and the killings that have happened in the Kashmir, they would leave a lasting impact on not just on the psyche, on the society, on the polity, and we will see that for a long time to come. And partly I find why the national media and this discourse that is going very shrill, very sort of one track, if I may use the word, and very one-sided. It's partly also because I find that the social scientists have either abdicated that space, we are not adequately in the public domain, getting engaged in those debates that we need to, or that space isn't given. I mean, this is an age of sound bites. If you can't sum up what you have to say, and if you don't have the lung power to shout everybody else out, and sort of say what you still have to say, ignoring the rest of the world, then most of us, what we do is we retract into our safer environments of academia and classrooms. But I really think the public space and the public debate on Kashmir is missing that social science inputs into that domain. And I really wish that more would come forward and engage with that debate and not just leave it for others to argue, because it is not just doing us and social science a disservice. I think it's doing Kashmir a disservice. That's what I'm saying. I feel that, and I include myself in it, that as social scientists, I think we are failing Kashmir. And it's still not too late, but I really hope, and that's what I keep telling all my research students, the more the better. We need good social science researching on Kashmir. So on that note, thank you for bringing out this book.
Thank you very much, Navnita. And just to say that, I wouldn't advise that you even try to engage on that media, because they don't want to listen to those voices. And every time those voices have tried to speak, they've been shouted down. So there's a very clear agenda here to vilify Kashmiris and to shout down anyone who has a view that's different from the ruling parties or different from the hyper-nationalist view. So I think you have to find a different space to be able to do it, or to just continue to do it through the few platforms on the web and on TV, very few that remain that will want to listen. And unfortunately, that space is shrinking. I unfortunately have to leave for a press conference. So Chitralekha is going to conduct the Q&A after this. I wish I could have stayed for this, because this is always the best part. I'm sure somebody will argue and say something crazy. Hopefully not, and it can be a it can be a civilized debate. But Chitralekha, over to you. Good luck.
I think you cursed us before leaving.
I see.
Or
only
maybe not,
sensible
maybe in a
faces.
positive way. Like, maybe you cursed us for that not to happen. But thank you all of you for your really fabulous comments on the book. But I just want to pick up what Navnita was saying, since you were the last one to speak, and also because you're an academic, and I can understand what your I can kind of sympathize with what you're saying, or empathize with what you're saying. But there does, if there are young people here and are thinking of doing research, I would urge you to work on Kashmir, because there is a lot of work that needs to be done. Even if academic voices are marginalized by the media, that Nidhi was talking about, we still need to continue to do that kind of work. And there are a lot of valiant people who are doing that kind of work. And in fact, one of the places that work that can be done is in regions of Gilgit-Baltistan and the Pakistani part of Kashmir, because the little quibble you had with this work, it's well taken, but the reason that is not included there is because there's no work on it. I mean, and again, the reason that there's no work on it is because someone like me, for instance, I'm an Indian citizen. I cannot work on those regions. I would never be given permission, right, to work. And so there's logistical sort of issues as well that one has to consider when one is thinking about doing research on Kashmir. I mean, even doing research in Srinagar is very, very difficult, as you know, for a variety of reasons. And so I wanted to kind of just say that in response to what you said about the research. I think, was it Siddharth or Siddiq, one of you also said the same thing about you wanted to learn more about the political movements in, I think it was you, in the Pakistani part of Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. And again, that kind of work is really difficult to do. I mean, Martin's students are now doing it. Martin Sokifal, who wrote the chapter on Gilgit-Baltistan, some of them are working on that kind of that kind of work. But again, I think a place like Kashmir